Captain William Matthews had served the British royal family for 23 years. His weathered hands gripped the ceremonial sword at his side as he stood at attention outside Kensington Palace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, but William barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation he'd had with his wife Sarah the night before. "You're different, Will," she had said, her voice soft with concern. "These past few months, you come home and just stare out the window. What's happening at work?" William couldn't tell her the truth. How could he explain that watching 10-year-old Prince George navigate the pressures of royal life was breaking his heart? The boy who should have been playing football with friends was instead sitting through endless etiquette lessons. The child, who should have been laughing carelessly, was learning to smile on command for photographers. As William adjusted his uniform for the 100th time that morning, he remembered his own son at that age. Tommy had scraped his knees climbing trees, got dirty playing in the mud, and cried openly when he was hurt. Prince George wasn't allowed any of those simple childhood freedoms. The palace doors opened, and out walked the young prince with his tutor, Mrs. Henderson. George's posture was perfect, his expression carefully neutral. But William had learned to read the subtle signs. The slight droop of the boy's shoulders told him everything. Another difficult lesson, another piece of childhood chipped away. "Good morning, Captain Matthews," Prince George said politely, his voice carrying the formal tone he'd been taught to use with staff. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," William replied, following protocol, but as their eyes met briefly, he saw something that made his chest tighten. The spark that had once danced in George's eyes when he was younger was dimming. The boy was learning to hide his true feelings, just like every royal before him. William had joined the Royal Guard with dreams of serving his country and protecting the monarchy he respected. He'd imagined heroic moments, important duties, and the honor of being trusted with royal safety. What he hadn't expected was to become emotionally invested in watching a child grow up under the weight of a crown he hadn't chosen to wear. That afternoon, as William stood guard during George's piano lesson, he could hear the music through the window. The boy played beautifully, but there was something mechanical about it. Perfect technique, no soul. When the lesson ended, William caught a glimpse of George's face as he closed the piano lid. For just a moment, the royal mask slipped, and William saw pure exhaustion in those young eyes. The breaking point came during the evening meal preparation. William was doing his security rounds when he heard crying coming from a small alcove near the kitchen. He found Prince George huddled behind a large plant, tears streaming down his face. The boy quickly wiped his eyes when he saw William approaching. "I'm sorry, Captain Matthews," George whispered. I just wanted a moment." William's heart shattered. Here was a 10-year-old boy apologizing for crying, for needing a moment to be human. The rigid training had taught George that showing emotion was somehow wrong, that being vulnerable was a failure of royal duty. "There's nothing to be sorry for, sir," William said gently, breaking protocol by kneeling down to George's level. "Everyone needs moments like this." For the first time in months, Prince George looked at William not as a guard, but as a person who might understand. In that moment, William made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't continue to be part of a system that was slowly crushing the spirit of this remarkable child. Something had to give, and he realized that something might have to be his career. As William tucked his own children into bed that night, he held them a little tighter. He thought about Prince George, probably lying in his grand bedroom, alone, with the weight of expectations that no child should carry. The decision was forming in his mind, though he didn't yet know how it would unfold. All he knew was that his role as protector might require him to protect Prince George from the very institution he'd sworn to serve. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events. Prince George approached Captain Matthews during the routine security briefing, something that rarely happened. The boy waited until the other staff members had left before speaking. "Captain Matthews," George said quietly. "Yesterday when you found me, thank you for not reporting it." William was surprised by the child's awareness of palace politics. Most 10-year-olds wouldn't think about the consequences of being seen crying, But George had already learned that his emotions could become official reports, discussed in meetings, analyzed by advisors. "You don't need to thank me for that, sir," William replied carefully. He wanted to say more, to tell the boy that crying was normal and healthy, but the walls had ears in the palace. George looked around nervously, then stepped closer. "Can I ask you something? Do you have children?" The question caught William off guard. Personal conversations between royal family members and security staff were discouraged, but there was something desperate in the boy's voice that made William answer honestly. "I do, sir. 2 children. A boy and a girl. Are they happy?" George asked, and the weight of that simple question nearly broke William's heart. "Yes, sir, they are." Prince George nodded slowly, processing this information. "What makes them happy?" William thought carefully about his answer. He could see that this conversation was important to George, perhaps the most important one the boy had had in months. Simple things, really. Playing games, spending time with friends, being allowed to make mistakes and learn from them. The sadness that crossed George's face was unmistakable. "I don't remember the last time I played a game," the prince admitted. "Not a real game. Everything is a lesson or a duty or a appearance." That afternoon, William watched as Prince George endured another grueling day of royal obligations. A photo session with visiting dignitaries where the boy had to stand perfectly still for 30 minutes while photographers captured the perfect shot. A meeting with education advisors who discussed his curriculum, as if he weren't in the room. A rehearsal for an upcoming public appearance where every gesture was choreographed. Through it all, George maintained his composure, but William could see the toll it was taking. The boy's hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. He barely touched his lunch, despite the kitchen staff preparing his favorite meal. Most telling of all, George had stopped asking questions about anything, simply accepting whatever was planned for him with resignation that seemed far too mature for his age. During his break, William called his wife Sarah from his private office. He needed to hear a normal voice to remember what life was like outside the golden cage of royal duty. "How are the kids?" he asked. "Oh, you know Tommy," Sarah laughed. "He came home covered in mud from head to toe. Apparently they were building a fort by the creek, and Emma lost her first tooth at school today. She's so excited about the tooth fairy coming tonight." William closed his eyes, picturing his children's joy over such simple things. The contrast with Prince George's day was stark and painful. "Sarah," he said slowly, "what would you do if you saw a child being hurt but everyone around thought it was normal?" There was a pause. "Will, what's going on? You're scaring me." "Just hypothetically, I'd protect that child," Sarah said without hesitation, "even if it meant going against everyone else. Some things are more important than keeping the peace." That evening, as William was finishing his shift, he encountered something that would change everything. Prince George was in the library, supposedly doing homework, but William could see the boy had pushed his books aside. Instead, George was looking at a photo album filled with pictures of other children playing. The album wasn't official palace material. Someone had given it to George, probably trying to help him understand what normal childhood looked like. The boy was studying each picture with intense concentration, as if trying to memorize what happiness looked like on other children's faces. William realized he was witnessing something profound and heartbreaking. Prince George was studying how to be a child, learning about childhood the same way he learned about diplomacy or public speaking. It wasn't natural or instinctive for him anymore. It had become another subject to master. "Sir," William said softly, making his presence known. George quickly closed the album, his face flushing with embarrassment. I finished my real homework early." "What you were doing was important too," William said, surprising himself with his boldness. George looked up at him with wide eyes. "Really?" "Really. Learning about happiness is just as important as learning about history or mathematics." For the first time in weeks, Prince George smiled a genuine smile. It was small, barely there, but it was real. In that moment, William knew his career at the palace was coming to an end. He couldn't continue to stand by and watch this extraordinary child lose himself in the machinery of royal duty. Something had to be done, and he was beginning to understand that the solution might require the most difficult decision of his life. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Prince George was scheduled for what the palace called a character-building exercise, a formal tea with elderly donors who contributed to royal charities. William watched from his post as the 10-year-old boy sat perfectly straight, making polite conversation with people old enough to be his great-grandparents. Such a well-behaved young man. One of the donors commented loudly. So mature for his age. William cringed at the words. Mature for his age. It was meant as a compliment. But all William could hear was the sound of childhood being stripped away piece by piece. George wasn't mature, he was trained. There was a significant difference. The tea dragged on for 2 hours. George never once slumped in his chair, never asked to use the bathroom, never showed any sign of the restlessness that would be normal for any child his age. He was like a small adult in a child's body, performing a role that demanded perfection. When the donors finally left, William watched George's shoulders sag with exhaustion. The boy's carefully maintained posture crumbled the moment the doors closed, and he looked around with the confused expression of someone waking up from a trance. Well done. Your Royal Highness, said Mrs. Henderson, the palace tutor. Your grandmother will be very pleased with the reports from today's guests. George nodded obediently, but William could see the emptiness in his response. The boy was going through the motions of acknowledgement without any real understanding of why this performance mattered or what it had cost him. That evening, William made an unprecedented decision. Instead of going straight home after his shift, he drove to a nearby park where children were playing. He sat on a bench and watched them run around, hearing their laughter, seeing their scraped knees and dirty clothes and wild hair. This was what childhood was supposed to look like: messy, loud, unpredictable, and joyful. He pulled out his phone and called his old friend Marcus, who worked as a child psychologist. Without mentioning names or specific details, William described what he'd been witnessing: a child losing his natural curiosity, becoming increasingly withdrawn, showing signs of anxiety about normal emotional expressions. Will, Marcus said seriously, what you're describing sounds like a child under severe psychological pressure. The isolation from peers, the constant performance expectations, the suppression of natural emotions. This can cause lasting damage to a child's development. What if this child's situation can't be changed easily? William asked. What if there are institutional pressures that make normal childhood impossible? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then someone needs to advocate for that child, even if it's difficult. Children don't have the power to advocate for themselves. They depend on the adults around them to recognize when something is wrong and take action. After the call, William sat in his car for a long time, watching the children in the park until darkness fell and their parents called them home. He thought about Prince George, probably in his room completing more assignments or preparing for tomorrow's obligations. No parent was calling him in from play because there had been no play to interrupt. The next morning brought a scene that would haunt William forever. He arrived early for his shift and found Prince George in the garden, sitting alone on a bench. The boy wasn't doing anything, not reading, not studying, not practicing. He was just sitting, staring at nothing with an expression of profound sadness that no child should ever wear. William approached carefully. Good morning, sir. You're up early today. George looked up at him with eyes that seemed much older than his 10 years. I had a dream, the prince said quietly. I dreamed I was just a regular boy. I went to a regular school and had regular friends, and my biggest worry was whether I'd done my math homework. The simple honesty of the statement hit William like a physical blow. Here was a child articulating his deepest wish, not for riches or power or fame, but for normalcy, for the right to be ordinary. It sounds like a nice dream, William said carefully. When I woke up, I felt sad for a few minutes before I remembered that being sad wasn't allowed, George continued. Then I felt guilty for feeling sad, and then I felt confused about feeling guilty. It's exhausting, Captain Matthews. Being me is exhausting. William knelt down beside the bench, abandoning protocol entirely. George, he said, using the boy's name without the title for the first time. You're allowed to feel sad. You're allowed to feel anything. Those feelings don't make you weak or wrong. They make you human. Tears began to stream down George's face, and for once he didn't try to hide them. But everyone expects me to be perfect. If I'm not perfect, I'm letting down the whole country. You're 10 years old, William said firmly. The country can wait for you to grow up at your own pace. In that moment, William realized that someone needed to be Prince George's voice, his advocate, his protector in a way that went beyond physical security. The boy needed someone to fight for his right to be a child, even if that fight came at a great personal cost. William looked at George's tear-streaked face and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He was going to step outside his role, outside the system, and find a way to give this remarkable child what he needed most: the chance to be young while he still could. William spent the weekend researching everything he could about child development and the psychological effects of extreme pressure on young minds. What he discovered only strengthened his resolve. Study after study showed that children who were denied normal developmental experiences often struggled with identity, relationships, and mental health later in life. Monday morning brought an opportunity that felt like fate. Prince George was scheduled for a private tutoring session in the palace garden, but his regular tutor had called in sick. Mrs. Henderson asked William if he could supervise the prince during his study time, ensuring his safety while he worked alone. "Of course, ma'am," William replied, recognizing the chance he'd been hoping for. Once they were alone in the garden, William made a decision that went against every rule in the palace handbook. Instead of maintaining his formal distance, he sat down on the grass near where George was supposed to be studying. "Sir, would you mind if I ask you a question?" William said. George looked up from his history book, surprised by the informal tone. "Of course, Captain Matthews. If you could do anything right now, anything at all, what would it be?" The question clearly caught George off guard. He set down his book and thought seriously about the answer, as if he'd never been asked such a thing before. I think I'd like to build something," George said slowly, "with my hands. Maybe a treehouse or a fort, something that wasn't planned by committees or designed by architects, something that was just mine." William felt his heart break and soar at the same time. Here was proof that the curious, creative child was still there, buried under layers of royal protocol but not completely lost. "What's stopping you from building something?" William asked. George gestured around at the perfectly manicured garden. "Everything here is protected, historical, important. I'm not allowed to change anything or move anything or create anything new." William looked around the garden with fresh eyes. It was beautiful, but it was also sterile. Every plant was perfectly placed, every path precisely maintained. There was no room for the kind of creative chaos that children needed. "What if I told you there was a place where you could build something?" William said carefully. "Somewhere private, where you could work with your hands and create something entirely your own?" George's eyes lit up with an excitement that William hadn't seen in months.
"Really? Where?"
William had been thinking about this since his conversation with Marcus. His own backyard had a wooded area that backed up to a nature preserve. It was private, secure, and completely ordinary. Exactly what Prince George needed. "I'd have to ask permission from your parents, of course," William said. "But I have a place where children build forts and tree houses, where getting dirty is expected and making mistakes is part of the learning process." For the first time since William had known him, Prince George looked like a normal 10-year-old boy, excited, hopeful, and full of possibility. That afternoon, William did something unprecedented. He requested a private meeting with Prince William and Catherine. It took 3 days to get on their schedule, during which William nearly lost his nerve a dozen times. He was about to suggest that the future King and Queen of England were raising their son incorrectly. The audacity of it was breathtaking. When the meeting finally came, William found himself in a sitting room he'd only seen from the doorway during security sweeps. Prince William and Catherine sat across from him, curious about why their head of security had requested such an unusual conversation. "Your Royal Highnesses," William began, his mouth dry with nerves. "I've served your family for over 2 decades, and I've never overstepped my boundaries before. But I'm concerned about Prince George." Prince William's expression became guarded. "What kind of concerns?" William took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. "He's losing his childhood, sir. The pressure, the constant performance expectations, the isolation from normal experiences. It's taking a toll on him emotionally." Catherine leaned forward. "What exactly have you observed?" William described the crying in the alcove, the exhaustion after formal events, the conversation about dreaming of being a normal boy. He spoke carefully but honestly about the sadness he'd witnessed, and the child's own words about feeling guilty for having emotions. "He told me that being himself is exhausting," William concluded. Your Royal Highnesses, with all due respect, he's 10 years old. He should be worried about playground games, not disappointing nations. The room fell silent. William could see the internal struggle on both parents' faces, the conflict between their roles as royals who understood duty and their instincts as parents who wanted their child to be happy. What are you suggesting? Prince William asked finally. Small changes, William said. Moments of normal childhood. Opportunities to be creative without supervision. To make friends outside the palace. To experience the kind of simple joys that build resilience and character in different ways than formal training. Catherine looked at her husband, and William could see a silent conversation happening between them. You mentioned something specific about building? She said. William explained his idea about the fort building, emphasizing the safety measures and privacy protections he'd considered. He watched as hope flickered in Catherine's eyes and determination grew in Prince William's expression. We've been so focused on preparing him for his future role, Prince William said quietly, that we may have forgotten he needs to be a child first. It was the opening William had hoped for, the sign that these parents were ready to fight for their son's well-being, even against the weight of centuries of tradition. The decision to allow Prince George's fort-building adventure created ripples throughout the palace hierarchy that William hadn't anticipated. Word of the unprecedented arrangement reached senior advisors, protocol officers, and various department heads, each with their own concerns about security, propriety, and tradition. Within hours of Prince William and Catherine approving the plan, William found himself in a conference room facing a panel of stern-faced officials who looked at him as if he'd suggested taking the crown jewels on a picnic. Captain Matthews, said Sir Edmund Hartwell, the senior private secretary, do you understand the security implications of what you're proposing? Taking His Royal Highness to an unsecured private residence? William had prepared for this conversation. Sir, I've conducted a full security assessment of my property. The location is isolated, easily monitored, and provides natural barriers that would actually make protection easier than many public venues the prince currently visits. But the precedent, interrupted Lady Margaret Thornberry from protocol. If we allow informal, unsupervised activities, where does it end? The young prince has responsibilities and expectations that cannot be ignored for the sake of childhood whims. The phrase childhood whims made William's jaw clench, but he kept his voice steady. Ma'am, with respect, building resilience, creativity, and emotional intelligence aren't whims. They're essential components of developing strong leadership skills. The debate continued for over an hour, with various officials raising concerns about everything from media exposure to insurance liability. William answered each objection methodically, but he could sense the underlying resistance wasn't really about practical concerns. It was about a fundamental philosophical difference regarding how future royals should be raised. Finally, Prince William himself entered the room, and the tenor of the discussion changed immediately. I've heard the concerns, the prince said without preamble, and I appreciate everyone's dedication to my son's safety and preparation for his future role. But I've made a decision as his father. George will have this opportunity to build his fort and experience a small piece of normal childhood. Captain Matthews has our full confidence in making this happen safely. The authority in Prince William's voice ended the debate, but William could see in several faces that the resistance hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning that felt like Christmas to Prince George, William drove the young prince to his family home for the first time. The boy pressed his face to the car window, fascinated by the ordinary neighborhoods they passed through. People just live here, George asked, watching children ride bicycles on sidewalks and families working in their gardens. Yes, sir. Regular families doing regular weekend things. When they arrived at William's house, Prince George met Tommy and Emma, William's children, who had been coached to treat their guest as just another kid, not as royalty. The initial awkwardness lasted about 5 minutes before George's natural curiosity and his desperate hunger for normal interaction took over. Want to see where we're going to build your fort? Tommy asked, and George nodded eagerly. The wooded area behind William's house was perfect. Tall enough trees for a proper treehouse, flat areas for ground-level construction, and enough space for the kind of creative chaos that William hoped would reawaken George's sense of wonder. For the first hour, George seemed almost paralyzed by the freedom. He kept asking permission for everything, to pick up a stick, to examine a rock, to sit on the ground. William realized the boy had been so conditioned to seek approval that independent action felt dangerous. "George," William said gently, "out here, you're in charge of your own project. You decide what to build and how to build it. There's no wrong way to do this." Gradually, something magical began to happen. George started making decisions without asking permission. He chose the location for his fort, selected which branches to use, and began hammering nails with an intensity that surprised everyone. When he hit his thumb with the hammer and let out a frustrated yell, he looked around nervously, as if expecting punishment for showing emotion. "Happens to everyone," Tommy said casually, showing George his own bruised thumbnail from a previous project. "Dad says it's like a badge of honor." For the first time in months, Prince George laughed, really laughed. The kind of full-bodied sound that comes from genuine amusement, rather than polite obligation. William watched from a respectful distance as George spent the next 4 hours building, problem-solving, getting dirty, and experiencing the pure satisfaction of creating something with his own hands. The transformation was remarkable. The rigid posture relaxed, the carefully controlled expressions gave way to natural reactions, and the spark that had been dimming in his eyes began to brighten again. When it was time to leave, George was covered in dirt, had a small scratch on his arm from a rough branch, and looked happier than William had seen him in years. "Can we come back next week?" George asked as they drove back to the palace. "If your parents approve." "Absolutely," William replied. "Captain Matthews," George said quietly, "thank you for helping me remember that I'm allowed to be happy." The simple statement hit William harder than any commendation or royal recognition ever could. This was why he'd risked his career, why he'd pushed against centuries of protocol, not for grand gestures or dramatic changes, but for the fundamental right of a child to experience joy. As they pulled through the palace gates, William could see George's posture beginning to straighten again, the informal ease of the afternoon giving way to the formal composure expected within these walls. But something was different now. The spark in the boy's eyes remained, hidden but not extinguished. William had given Prince George something that no amount of royal training could provide, the memory of what it felt like to be purely, simply, joyfully himself. The fort-building Saturdays continued for 6 weeks, and the change in Prince George was remarkable. William noticed it first in small ways. The boy stood differently, with less rigid formality and more natural confidence. His questions during palace briefings became more thoughtful and creative rather than simply dutiful. Most importantly, he had started smiling genuine smiles again, not just the practiced expression he'd learned for public appearances, but the improvements in George's well-being created an unexpected problem. Other staff members began to notice the change and, not knowing the source, started asking questions. Some praised the young prince's increased engagement and apparent happiness. Others, particularly those from the old guard, viewed any deviation from traditional royal behavior with suspicion. Sir Edmund Hartwell, who had opposed the fort project from the beginning, began keeping closer watch on both Prince George and William. He noticed the boy's slightly more relaxed posture, his increased willingness to express opinions, and what Edmund saw as a dangerous tendency toward informality. The crisis came during the 7th week, when Prince George was scheduled for a formal portrait session with a renowned royal photographer. These sessions were typically exercises in patience and precision, with the young prince required to hold exact poses for extended periods while maintaining perfect royal composure. This time was different. George, emboldened by weeks of being allowed to be himself during fort-building time, began asking questions about the photography process. He wondered aloud why he had to look so serious when he felt happy. He suggested that maybe some pictures should show him smiling naturally, instead of wearing the formal expression he'd been taught. The photographer, a traditionalist who had been capturing royal portraits for decades, was flustered by these unexpected interactions. He complained to Mrs. Henderson, who reported to Sir Edmund, who saw this as confirmation of his worst fears about William's influence on the young prince. That evening, William was summoned to another conference room meeting, but this one felt very different from the earlier discussions. The atmosphere was tense and the questions were pointed. "Captain Matthews," Sir Edmund began, "we've noticed some concerning changes in His Royal Highness's behavior. A certain casualness that wasn't present before your special arrangements began. William chose his words carefully. "I've noticed that Prince George seems happier and more engaged, sir. I would consider those positive changes." "Happiness is not the primary objective here," Lady Thornbury said sharply. "Proper royal bearing and adherence to protocol are essential skills that must be ingrained from an early age. We cannot have the future king developing casual attitudes toward his responsibilities." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with various officials expressing concerns about precedent, tradition, and the importance of maintaining royal dignity. William defended the fort project and its positive effects on George's emotional well-being, but he could sense the tide turning against him. Finally, Sir Edmund delivered what felt like an ultimatum. "Captain Matthews, while we appreciate your dedication to the prince's security, we feel that your current role may be expanding beyond appropriate boundaries. We are recommending that the informal activities be discontinued, and that your direct interactions with Prince George be limited to essential security matters only." William felt his heart sink. They were asking him to step back from the very relationship that had allowed him to help George. Worse, they were essentially demanding that he return the boy to the isolation and pressure that had been slowly crushing his spirit. "Sir," William said, "with respect, I believe Prince George has benefited significantly from having opportunities to develop naturally. Taking away those experiences could be harmful to his emotional development." "That's not your decision to make," Sir Edmund replied coldly. "Your job is security, not child psychology or royal development. We have experts for those areas who are far more qualified than a guard to determine what's best for the future king." That night, William sat in his study, staring at photos from the fort-building Saturdays. Pictures of George laughing as he hammered boards together, concentrating intensely as he solved construction problems, beaming with pride as his project took shape. The boy in these photos looked like any other 10-year-old, curious, energetic, genuinely happy. William thought about what would happen if the fort visits stopped. George would return to the rigid schedule of lessons, formal obligations, and constant performance pressure. The spark that had been rekindled would dim again, and the natural curiosity that had begun to resurface would be buried under layers of protocol and expectation. But William also knew that defying direct orders from senior palace officials would likely cost him his job. He'd built his entire career around service to the royal family, and losing that position would mean starting over at age 45. Sarah and the children depended on his steady income and the security that came with his role. As he wrestled with the decision, William received an unexpected phone call. It was Prince William calling from his private line. "Captain Matthews, I understand there was a meeting today about George's weekend activities," the prince said without preamble. "Yes, sir. There are concerns about the impact on his formal development." There was a long pause before Prince William spoke again. "Catherine and I have been watching our son these past weeks. We've seen him become more confident, more curious, more genuinely happy than he's been in months. We've also received reports suggesting that this improvement is somehow problematic." William waited, unsure how to respond. "I want you to know," Prince William continued, "that as George's father I support what you've been doing. But I also understand the pressures you're facing from the institution. The decision about what to do next shouldn't fall entirely on your shoulders." The conversation ended with no clear resolution, but William understood the subtext. Prince William was caught between his instincts as a father and his obligations as a future king. He wanted to support what was best for George, but he also couldn't openly defy the palace establishment without causing an institutional crisis. William realized that the next decision he made would determine not just his own future, but the trajectory of a young boy's childhood, and possibly his entire relationship with the role he would one day inherit. The final Saturday arrived with an autumn chill that seemed to mirror William's heavy heart. He had decided to honor one last fort-building session with Prince George before making his announcement. The boy deserved a proper goodbye, though William wasn't sure how to explain what was about to happen. George bounded out of the car with his usual weekend enthusiasm, but William noticed the boy seemed to sense something was different. Children, especially those who have learned to read adult emotions for survival, often pick up on subtle changes in atmosphere. "Is everything all right, Captain Matthews?" George asked as they walked toward the woods. "You seem sad today." William marveled at the boy's perceptiveness, A few months ago, George wouldn't have felt comfortable making such an observation about an adult's emotional state. The fort-building Saturdays had given him back his natural empathy and curiosity about others. "I have something important to tell you, George," William said, using the boy's name without the title, as had become their custom during these private times. "But first, let's work on your fort one more time." They spent the morning putting finishing touches on what had become an impressive structure. Part treehouse, part ground fort, entirely George's own creation. The boy had learned to use tools, solve structural problems, and most importantly, trust his own instincts and creativity. As they worked, George chatted about his week, sharing observations about his lessons and asking William's opinion about various palace events. The conversation was natural and easy, the kind of relationship that William realized George had never been allowed to have with any adult before. When the fort was finished, George stood back to admire his work with obvious pride. "It's really mine, isn't it?" he said. "I mean, I actually built this myself." "You absolutely did," William confirmed. "Every decision, every nail, every solution to problems that came up, that was all you." George smiled, the genuine, unguarded smile that had become William's favorite sight in the world. Then the boy's expression grew serious, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment to say something important. "Captain Matthews," George said, "I know something's wrong. The palace feels different this week. People have been whispering more than usual, and Mrs. Henderson keeps looking at me like she's worried about something." William sat down on a fallen log and gestured for George to join him. It was time for the conversation he'd been dreading. "George, sometimes adults have to make very difficult decisions. The people who work at the palace think that our Saturday visits might not be the best thing for your royal education." George's face fell. "They want to stop the fort building? They think you should spend more time on traditional royal training and less time on informal activities." The boy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness of someone much older. When he finally spoke, his words surprised William. "What do you think, Captain Matthews? Not as my guard, but as someone who has children. Do you think they're right?" William looked at this remarkable boy, confident enough now to ask for an honest opinion, mature enough to handle a complex answer, but still young enough to need protection and advocacy. "I think," William said carefully, "that you've learned important things here that you couldn't learn anywhere else. You've discovered that you're capable of creating something beautiful with your own hands. You've experienced the satisfaction of solving problems independently. You've remembered what it feels like to be happy without having to perform happiness for others." George nodded thoughtfully. "And they think those things will make me a bad king someday? They worry that being too informal or too happy might make you less royal." George stood up and walked to his fort, running his hand along the wood he'd shaped and assembled. "But don't you think a king should understand what makes people happy? How can I care about my subjects if I don't remember what joy feels like?" The wisdom in the 10-year-old's words took William's breath away. In 7 Saturday sessions, George had developed insights about leadership and empathy that years of formal education hadn't taught him. "George," William said, "I have to tell you something else. I've decided to step down from my position as your security captain." The boy spun around, his eyes wide with shock and hurt. "Because of me? Because I asked too many questions or wasn't royal enough?" "No," William said firmly. "Because I believe children should be allowed to be children, and I can't continue to work in a system that thinks your happiness is dangerous to your future." George ran to William and hugged him tightly, something that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of their journey together. "But who will help me remember that it's okay to feel things? Who will remind me that I'm allowed to be myself?" William hugged the boy back, fighting tears. "You'll remember, George. You're stronger now than when we started. You know what happiness feels like, and you know you deserve it. No one can take that knowledge away from you." They spent their final hour together in comfortable silence, with George putting the last touches on his fort, and William memorizing every detail of this extraordinary child who had changed his understanding of courage, duty, and what it truly meant to protect someone. As they drove back to the palace for the last time as guard and prince, George made one final statement that would stay with William forever. "Captain Matthews, when I'm king someday, I'm going to remember this fort. I'm going to remember that being happy and being responsible aren't opposites, and I'm going to make sure that other children, even royal children, get to build things with their own hands and discover who they really are." William submitted his resignation the following Monday. along with a detailed report recommending that future royal childhood development include regular opportunities for informal, creative, and emotionally nurturing experiences. His recommendations were filed away and largely ignored. But Prince George never forgot the lessons learned in those woods. Years later, as a young adult, Prince George would often speak about the importance of emotional intelligence in leadership, the value of understanding common experiences, and the need for future royals to develop genuine empathy alongside traditional skills. Palace insiders would wonder where these revolutionary ideas came from, not knowing they were born during 7 Saturdays in a makeshift fort, under the protective watch of a guard who chose a child's well-being over his own career security. William never regretted his decision. Some forms of service, he learned, require the courage to step outside the system in order to truly protect what matters most.